glad to be here, and thanks to Charles for organizing this. As he mentioned, I'm currently a fellow, and often I ask the question, I'm not a fresh graduate, why the heck am I doing a fellowship? And I'll go over that at the later part of my presentation. As Charles mentioned, I was at Oak Ridge National Lab for 5.5 years almost, from 2017, where I did majority of the work that I'm going to present today. Prior to the lab, I was a tenured faculty in Mississippi, where I did similar work, but from the academic perspective. So my work here, what I'm presenting today, are the work in the DOE space that is still ongoing. So energy resilience in the face of climate change. I think we hear that a lot nowadays. Resilience has become a buzzword, which should not be a surprise, because resilience is not a new thing either. It has always been there. At least in 1970, there was discussion, civil engineering people do it, sociology, psychology, every discipline has it. So what are we talking when we talk about energy resilience? And here what I'm presenting is my perspective of energy resilience coming from a geospatial background, as well as my undergrad in engineering and a master's in planning. So I'm basically borrowing my qualifications to address this topic at a broader scale. And why should we do that? So U.S. energy consumption, this is from Energy Information Administration, EIA.gov, the report they generate every year about the energy consumptions. They do forecasting of how much of energy is to be consumed in different sectors and the energy sources that are being used. As you can see, the energy consumption has been steadily growing in the US from 1950 up until now. There is a forecast that it may slow down over the next 30 years. But at the same time, it gives you an idea how much of energy we consume. And in fact, in 2021, US consumed about 3.9 trillion kilowatt hours. That was 13 times more than what we consumed in 1950. And of that 3.9 kilowatt hours, more than 90% was used by the residential sectors. Not any other residential buildings, we spend a lot of energy. And if you take a look at on the bottom chart, the right bottom chart, majority of the consumption in the residential areas is coming from space heating and cooling purposes and water heating. As I think all of us experienced the temperature drop in December timeframe, where we had power outages, rolling outages. That's what we were asked to do. Some people probably had their HVAC system not working properly because of the temperature drop. It is not designed to handle that kind of a drop. We also have seen the flooding and the outages in California that is still going, and the rolling blackouts in California, so on and so forth. There is no shortage of blackouts and outages, which means the situation is going to probably worsen. And as such, in the US, the population is also expected to grow to 438 million, so more than what we have now by 2050, which means there will be more buildings coming up. And while driving up here, I saw a lot of construction going on, and Knoxville has been expanding. So that gives an idea what is happening across the US. So it's not just in one pocket in the US where the situation is happening. So if the US consumption is happening, what is happening to the energy sector? It's not just the cost burden is going up for certain communities. And in Texas, we have seen the rates change and so on and so forth. The Uri storm is a good example. In the US, the energy sector and extreme events, they seem to be on a colliding path because majority of our energy infrastructures, if you ever pull down the data sets from Department of Homeland Security, where they have the energy infrastructure data, you'll find majority of the infrastructures, the power stations, they are located along the coastal areas. So there itself lies a problem, like they are highly susceptible to coastal events like flooding from different tropical storm or sea level rise. But we also, as you can see, there is an increase in number of power outages too. They have gone up tenfold, and majority of them are generally weather-related events, not cyber attack happening. We did have some cyber events, and Colonial Pipeline of 2021 is a good example of the cyber attack. But majority of the time, it is the weather-related events that cause power outages. And during the 80% of the power outages during 2003 to 12 were weather related, and out of them 59% were basically from storm events, whether hydrometeorological like tropical storms, tornadic events, those kind of things. There was a report that came out from NOAA late last year that gives you an idea of the number of billion-dollar disasters that has been happening in the country. And the chart is also off the roof. At this point, it seems like it. So the number of events we are experiencing is going up. And majority of the infrastructures are across the areas that are subjected to different kind of hydrometeorological events and also geological events like earthquakes in California area. And population is growing, so do I have to explain what the heck is going on? I don't think so. I think we all know what is going on, which means we are going to experience a lot more power outages. But that is not the only issue. There is also an increase in energy consumption because of the heating and the cooling. The consumption is also going up. So there is a need to understand where the outages are happening, where the consumption is going to go up. Can we do something to reduce the impact of those power outages on the communities while addressing alternate energy sources to decarbonize? So they all go hand in hand. It's not just one thing has to be fixed while the others have not. So from that perspective, when I was at the lab, we undertook several projects to address this. So these are the impacts of power outages. This is not the entire list of it. Hurricane Ida left about 1.2 million without power. Winter Storm Uri in Texas left 4.5 million and caused millions of dollars of damages. The U.S. customers, again, the Energy Information Administration mentioned that in 2020, the customers experienced 1.33 billion hours of outages, 73% more than what was reported in 2019. And often the power outages are happening. It's not just the energy infrastructure is burdened, but there was a report that was generated by American Society for Civil Engineers in 2021 that gave the energy infrastructure a C grade. Our infrastructure is really fragile and old. It is not equipped to handle the increasing demand, as well as the physical reliability is such that we experience outages because the transmission lines, the distribution lines are failing, or sometimes the poles. Because if you have wooden poles, they are old, then you can imagine it is going to blow away. They also cost in 2018 about $150 billion to businesses. These are only the dollar figures. I'm not talking about the societal impacts too. There were reports that were, I don't know how many of you remember reading the news articles during the Texas storm Uri. Some of the people without powers, they could not use their ventilators. COVID was ongoing. Those people who were staying in the house, they needed their oxygen, and if the ventilator is attached, it is not functioning. So it means it is not a dollar loss, but there are also your life lost in that process. And there is the last part is the critical infrastructures. We all rely on energy for our daily function. So anytime energy is gone, we can't do it. I'm not kidding. In my neighborhood, we had 2 power outages in 3 weeks, and I was thinking, what the heck am I going to do? I better have my generator pulled out because I can't do my work. So we are so dependent on it, but rarely we think about what is going on. But nowadays, more and more discussion is happening. So, energy resilience, what do I mean by it? There are 2 definitions of resilience that I'm pointing to, which are pretty recent, not going back to the 1970s. The Presidential Policy Directive 21 in 2013 talks about critical infrastructure security and resilience. It's not just making them resilient, but also secure. What they mean is we should have the ability to prepare for and adapt to the changing conditions while recovering from any disruption in the long term. Likewise, the National Academy's report that came out in 2012 talks about that we need to have a monitoring process to assess the resilience in the current baseline so that we know what needs to be done. From a DOE perspective, the focus is to implement a risk-based approach. Like we assess the risk, what is going to be happening using the current baseline, but also the futuristic situation with climate change, population expansion, and land use, what the risk is going to be, and using that risk, understand what the resilience metrics looks like based on what we have right now versus what needs to be done from a policy perspective, from an engineering perspective, and science and technological advancements. These are only in the one part of it, but we all know about the Justice 40 initiative. There comes the other aspect of energy resilience, not just the grid that deals with the humans. So we have to reduce the energy burden of it. There are many communities who can't afford. So for them, it's not about coming up with a very high-end HVAC system that is going to reduce their energy cost. They can't afford to have the HVAC. Forget about not paying enough for their energy cost. Then reducing the environmental exposure and burdens. Decarbonization, basically going towards clean energy technology, but also increasing its adoption. And low cost, the accessibility. Often the accessibility and affordability, they go hand in hand. And coming up with a pipeline, job pipeline and training. I don't know, how many have you thought about having solar panels in your house? Do you have them right now? Often the problem is it's not we don't want it. Our workforce needs to be trained to put the solar panels up the roof too. So not necessarily I can go to Home Depot and ask somebody, hey, can you fix my shingles along with my solar panels? I don't know. So we have to have that workforce training and the pipeline to make sure we have skilled workforce to help with that. It's not the case right now. And then stakeholder engagement. Utilities are responsible for energy in the US. I work in DOE headquarters, but I have no say. None of us have. So which means they have to be on board for any changes to happen because it is a cost burden on them too. They are thinking about the profit margin in the long run. So keeping these things in mind, some of the things, I'm not going to talk about that first two. I can take questions and there are slides. I'll talk about the remaining, but these are the projects that I took during the 5 years. The first one deals with flooding. It is a global thing. Like we are forecasting flood severity globally on a daily basis for alerting purposes. And that helps developing countries. In the US, we are pretty well off. In the developing world, they don't have that info. So we were trying to see, can we provide anything? The second one was looking at urban heat islands, specifically under the heat wave conditions where the energy burden is distributed at the city level and how the energy consumption relates back to the socioeconomic conditions as well as the impervious surface and the urbanization aspect. The power outages, we were looking at understanding where the power outages are happening. I think the moment there is a power outage, we get a notice from KUB or some other utility saying, hey, you have a power outage, or you may or may not get it too. But often there is a need to understand where the power outage is happening before you go and fix it. Understanding the infrastructure damages. Then the last two, looking at restoration modeling and energy supply. Can I rely on alternate sources? And I'll go through why the need came for those projects and what we were trying to get at. So the first one is wide area outage using satellite imagery. On the top right-hand side is the Eagle Eye platform. The Eagle Eye platform is a DOE platform that is managed by the Department of Energy's CSER program. What it does is it provides situational awareness information about power outages, infrastructure conditions on the ground whenever there is an extreme event going on for decision making. It is used by mostly Fed, especially DOE, and in some cases, Department of Homeland Security and FEMA. That's it, not any stakeholders at this point. When Hurricane Maria happened, I was new at the lab, but one thing that was quickly clear is that utilities were not able to provide the information of what is happening on the ground with outages because the communication infrastructures were down. You can tweet, but after a while your phone is not going to work because you are out of battery, so you are not able to do anything. So we were asked, hey, can you guys come up with a way to identify where the outage is happening, how many people are being impacted, so that we have an understanding of where to target our resources from a resource planning perspective. So the objective was to use satellite imagery for wide area monitoring. It is done on a daily basis. So every day morning, we would generate the report about how many customers are experiencing outages. Then we will send out the reports to DOE, NGA, DHS, so on and so forth. So we used the visible band of day-night band imagery. All of you have seen the nightlight imagery that NOAA has that shows what the lights look like in the night globally? That's the imagery. That comes out every day on a daily basis, so we use that one. The light intensity basically captures what is happening on the ground. The intensity is then related back to the number of customers and population distribution on the ground. Then we used customer data and population data. There is a land scan. grid population data that is generated by Oak Ridge National Lab. We use that to determine where the population distribution is and what is that. I'll go over it, but I can go over detail later on. So the pre-processing, what we did is basically we got the imagery today. We had to compare the imagery to a baseline. So we went back at least 2 months prior when there was never any outage. We got the intensity, the light, the imagery from that 2 months prior as the baseline, and every day was compared to the baseline to understand how much light intensity changed. That change in intensity was used along with the population to estimate the customers as well as the population. So there are a bunch of algorithms running behind the screen, but that's exactly what we did to give them a distribution on a daily basis and also to show them where the population should be restored, where the restoration activities should be targeted for it. This goes to the same workflow pipeline, but it shows you the difference in power outages in 2 different time periods, today versus last week, if the power outage has been a continuing process, but you have an idea about how many people are still in dark and where it should go. And we did the same thing for Winter Storm Yuri, but also during Ukraine's. When Russia attack happened in Ukraine, we basically use the same algorithm, and the imagery is globally available to get an understanding of what's happening there as well from a decision-making perspective. So this algorithm is up and running in Eagle Eye, and it could be done anywhere in the global, so it is not restricted to the US context only. But what it does is, it may not be very precise in the sense to decimal values, but it gives you an idea about where is resource need. So especially for stakeholders and emergency managers, they want to understand where they need to target, what needs to be done. So that's the whole point of this exercise, was where DOE is supposed to send resources on the ground. So that's how we are doing it. That same time, this discussion popped up. Okay, now we know where the resource needs to go. Can we think about having some alternate sources of energy, like having a generator in my backyard versus having a microgrid? So for a hospital, a microgrid helps them. Even if there is a long-term outage, the microgrid could be used for their purpose. Or having alternate reserves or transformers. So any kind of alternate energy source, where should we have them? Because we are not supposed to just randomly put them wherever they go. There has to be a strategic placement of it. So that was another question that came up. Can we have strategic placement of certain alternate energy sources that could be used for expediting the restoration process, especially for critical facilities like hospitals, fire stations, police stations, some of those critical assets, or even groceries, because people need to have access to the grocery stores. So we basically used a set of criteria, and that paper also, they all have the manuscript, so you can read through the details about the methodology too. We used physical characteristics, the social conditions, as well as the natural events and transportation and hydrographic conditions to address it. This gives you the list of all the criteria that we used. In terms of natural hazards in Puerto Rico, it was not just having tropical storm events, but also landslides. They do experience a lot of landslides, so we took into account landslides, tornadoes. We also took into account any of the earthquake fault line existence, so that place is probably not a good idea to have any strategic transformer. With regard to the population, we wanted to identify the densely populated areas because they would require a little faster restoration and you can move outwards. The transportation networks, because sometimes the question comes, why the heck do I need to care about the roads? But those equipments have to be driven on the road. If your road is not wide enough, it is not going to go. So some of them might have a low bridge, so the truck cannot go through. So we had to take into account the road network to identify the potential roads for that, and as well as slopes. If it is up on the mountain, it would be very expensive to move there, but so we had to identify those. So based on that, we identified potential locations where facilities could be located, as well as the current conditions, suitability of the current facilities in Puerto Rico. As you can see, everything is along the coastal area in Puerto Rico. No wonder there is a lot of problem when it comes to outages and restoration activities. So we have another project that started last year, just I wasn't part of it for 8 months, but they were looking at the grid resilience of the entire island by taking into consideration the current condition and how much of land use change is going to happen with a futuristic expansion as well as climate changes. So more than 56% of the land mass is unsuitable in the island, which is a concern because there are a lot of people, which means they probably would be experiencing long-term outages. The flooding is a major risk to the current energy infrastructure, which means utilities need to spend more money in moving them inland in a secure place. And only 16%, 42% of the power plants and substations are in suitable areas, so which is a major concern. And if we expand the same analysis to rest of the US, it gives a similar picture. And there was a study that was done by NOAA, and the report was published a few years ago. It shows the energy infrastructure, they are located in highly physically risky areas, so we need to take action for that. So those two projects led to coming up with this one. And I know we are moving away from oil and natural gas. However, we have not moved away from oil and natural gas. In the Northeast, they are used. I have gas stove in my house, so I know. So, like a natural gas. So, in the Northeast also, they are used for heating and cooling purposes. After Hurricane Sandy, they found out that they did not have heating and cooling because the supply wasn't there, and utilities was not giving them any report how long it is going to be available, where they can get their energy supply, and so on and so forth. And DOE quickly wanted to understand, okay, what is happening on the ground? Utilities are not required to share that information. It's just not. So DOE has to come up with a strategy to have this information with regard to the liquid fuel availability and demand. Where the demand is, where is the availability, how long it is going to take them to get to that. And one of the things I remember, one of the program managers saying, when there is a tropical storm in Florida, when I'm dealing with that region, I'm being asked, hey, we are running out of gas in these gas stations. There is a lot of evacuation happening. What is going to happen? They are stranded there. How long it is going to take to get those gas stations filled up? And the gas station, we don't think about it, they go backward to the rack facilities, to the refineries. Florida is one place, they don't have a train line, they don't have a train line or an underground pipeline with that. They have to use barge for transportation. So those things do add up with the time aspect of it. So we were, with this project, we developed a model and we are expanding to other regions, was to prioritize the deliveries of liquid fuel during extreme events depending upon demand and the supply aspect of it, and also to coordinate asset response among the first responders. Those were the two things that we were asked to address. So this is the modeling framework, which is at a very conceptual high level, that has a hierarchical supply demand that starts with the local gas stations and goes backwards to refineries, and takes into account both railroads as well as your normal road network. We do not have shipment associated with this model at this point. And the focus is the moment the volumetric fuel level drops below the 10%, that's when you need to refuel them. That means there has to be a strategy in place for those gas stations to be refilled quickly, or they are not going to be used. These are the diagrams that gives an idea. We did it for Florida because that was the first ask. Hey, can you guys do it for Florida? Because it is one of the states, there were a lot of hurricanes and tropical storms. And by June, the question pops, do we have everything in ready so that we are good to go in Florida? So that's why we started with there. And that gives you an idea. The top left-hand picture shows you the accessibility to the fuel stations, especially with regard to where the major concentrations are, population concentration, as well as the evacuation networks. Not just roads, they have to be evacuation networks going northbound, not anywhere else, because anytime there is a storm, you are going to go away from that impacted zone. The top right hand shows you the number of gas stations, and they reduce actually. You can see not the entire state is occupied by gas stations with high capacity or high number of pumping stations. If you don't have high number of pumping stations and high capacity, that means when you are evacuating, you should not be going there. If you go there, then you are stuck in the traffic at that point and you should be going northbound. So that's the whole point they were trying to get at. Then we also implemented a simulator to see how long it is going to take for each gas station to run out of gas under different conditions. Different conditions means having different types of vehicles coming in. But it may be a truck, it may be a van, it may be a sedan. And so based on that, or it may be a hybrid, so how long it is going to take them to run out of gas. So that gives an idea based on the fuel capacity what's happening. We generated a risk score for Hurricane Sally at every 6 hours. We used the National Hurricane Center data that is for storm surge and wind speed, because some of the gas stations, if they are in the high wind speed zone, they are not going to be used. The generators will not be working there, so it is non-functional at that point. So you need to move on. So we had to take into account the generator availability in those gas stations as well. So this gives you a distribution of the risk scores for each gas stations under different conditions of wind and storm surge across the entire state for 2 different hurricanes. We also have a visualization tool that is used. We used that one for actually in Colonial Pipeline. When the cyber attack happened in Colonial Pipeline, we used the model and the visualization tool to identify which gas stations were experiencing. They were running out of gas because we were asked by DOE, especially, I'm not kidding, you can look up Secretary Granholm asking, can you tell us, because you have this tool, what is going on the ground? We're like, okay, let's try, why not? So this tool is basically, again, for decision-making purpose. We are not competing with utilities in any sense of the word or any of the industry partners. We do collaborate with them because we want to understand the processes they have in place to address these situations, so we can mimic them on our end and generate the outputs for decision-making purpose. That is the whole point. And we do have MOUs in place in some of the industry partners. This project also started at the same time. Again, tropical storm seems to be a driver for new projects in the DOE space, where the focus was to estimate how much time it is going to take to restore any specific area, because you may have a substation down, you may have few distribution lines down, you may have few poles down, but how long it is going to take to restore. And that's all they wanted to know. And again, the focus was to assist with resource planning and understand the processes in place. We used outage data, power outage data that is part of Eagle Eye, and also we collected from utilities. We also have customer data, road networks, then vegetation, because often the line failure is because some tree branch falling on top of it rather than anything else. So the land use distribution and vegetation canopy is needed. And then, again, near real-time hazard information. If the hazard is ongoing, then you cannot have restoration activities there, and it is a coordinated activity between the city and the utilities. You just can't just go there. So we did the study for 5 different events that goes through the list. We started out with Irma, then we did for Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Zeta, Laura, as well as Michael. They all have different characteristics, especially Hurricane Harvey. It was kind of there on top of Houston area, continuously on and off running. So the power outages seem to be choppy. They are not gone for a longer time. So we wanted to understand even the tropical storm category changes, and if the storm characteristics changes, can we model the restoration time pretty quickly, but also reliably, not just have a number. So this is the decay function, the math function that is used for computing the restoration time. But in the sake of time, I just am skipping through. These are the distribution of restoration timeline for 5 events. And as you can see, for one event specifically in case of Michael, it has the outage distribution is not a smooth line. It came back, then it went out. It came back, then it went out. So in those conditions, the model does not perform well yet. But in the other conditions, if the outage started and we know the outage is ongoing, then we were able to capture how long it is going to take up. And when we say restoration, it is not 100% restoration, it is 80% restoration. Utilities do that. They are trying to get how long it is going to take them to restore 80%. The 20% in the rural areas, they take their own time because of accessibility situations and vegetation conditions. Rural areas take a little longer for them. So we were trying to get to the 80% threshold in this case. This one shows the Hurricane Irma distribution timeline as well as the rate of restoration. how long the restoration process is taking there, but also the rate of restoration in the sense, if you are going to spend the crews and you have 2 crews, do I reduce that? So that's all. And we wanted to do it at a county level as well as the utility service area level, because each utility has their own service area. And in case of smaller utilities like KUB, they may not have the resources and the crew members, so they have to rely on other utilities to help them out. So that's why we were trying to do it in service area to get an understanding where there might be resource need from other utilities. So this basically gives you, this is the agent-based model. I think it may not run. It is running. Okay. So there is an agent-based model as well, where we are accounting for the climate conditions, the current ground conditions, where the damages are happening, where the infrastructures are, to get an estimation of when I change my crew numbers. Suppose I have a crew of 4 members, how long it is going to take. If I change it to 2 crews with 8 numbers, how much it is going to change. So we can give a range of time to them for the decision-making process. The goal is to expand it to the whole US, so which is a massive undertaking. It's not an impossibility, but because we have the baseline models, but that's where DOE wants to go for decision-making purposes. So this goes to the question, as I said, I talked about grid resilience, but energy system is a complex network. The way I see it in my head, there are the utilities and the grid resilience. That is the physical infrastructure, where we have to think about the impacts, the climatic events, how the load is increasing because of population growth and expansion, and the physical condition of it, the reliability. And that maintenance is done by utilities. They are responsible for it. But we also have on the other side the community energy resilience, where the humans come into picture. And that's where, again, they experience the same things, but there is the energy justice and energy burden, the economic aspect that plays a role. The economy comes into the discussion. And then the last part, where a lot of discussion is happening nowadays, that we need to have microgrids, we need renewables, we need clean energy to not only achieve decarbonization, but also developing new technologies in HVAC for energy efficiency. Because energy efficiency not necessarily equate to energy resilience. They don't. They have different way of dealing with it. And that requires, when we go to this last phase, we need to have new technologies, but policies for adoption. The Inflation Reduction Act is a good example of it, that is giving a lot of incentive for households to have new EVs. Then like 7,000 plus can be deducted for the EV cost or anything. But the question comes, it's not only getting $7,500 to buy an EV. Can I afford to buy the EV? That's the question, not just getting a deduction of $7,500. So there has to be policies in place, not just making sure that these technologies exist and the energy economics. That's the way I see it in my head. So it's not just doing one part, but taking into the other part. And the community energy resilience has the houses, the buildings. So far, all the projects I went over, they address the problem of energy resilience at a regional scale, not at the household level. And my fellowship basically allows me to do that in the Building Technologies Office. The Building Technologies Office goes to individual buildings, looking at what the energy consumption is in individual building, both in the residential and the commercial area, doing a projection what that consumption is going to look like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road, and also accounting for new materials. Like there are projects, for instance, the zero energy ready homes, they are looking at new building materials to be used in the facade, along with having solar panels in the windows as well as on the outside, so you can use it for energy efficiency as well as energy generation. Having envelopes like the foams we have in the house, there are material engineers looking at foams that can reduce the penetration of heat into the house. So that's where they do of technologies. Developing storages, thermal storages. There are so many different types of thermal storage, but not necessarily everything is going to go on top of my roof, because my roof is not designed to hold that weight, which means it has to go somewhere. Can the thermal storage be part of my wall so that I can use it? Those are the technologies that are developed in the BTO office. So my fellowship, that's what I'm trying to get at. Like, going beyond the regional, I need to go to the individual building to understand what's happening at that granular level, so I can tie it back to the regional forecasting so that there is a connection. And that's where I'm looking at this fellowship, to understand the science and technology happening in that space, but also how the policy is being designed to address energy resilience. It cannot be just saying, yeah, energy justice. Okay, what does that mean? So there has to be a policy in place. So that's my take on energy resilience and how the policy, everything comes circled together. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll take some questions. I'm going to exert host privilege and take the first question, though. So oftentimes when I talk to people about resilience, after a while, you start to realize that what they're talking about is reliability, right? And that they're using those terms interchangeably. Now, from your presentation, what you seem to be saying is that resilience is just as much about what you do after the outage as it is about preventing the outage.
Yes.
Now, in my mind, increasing resilience would sort of decrease the damaging effects of having outages to begin with. But I don't hear conversations thinking that way, right? We're still stuck on, we're going to prevent all blackouts with 100% probability, right? And then we're also going to have resilience, which seems, when you think about it that way, to kind of conflict with one another. So can you talk a little bit about how those thoughts about resilience versus reliability kind of intertwine?
Yes. When I say the reliability, because that's why I said in the resilience, when the grid sector it is the reliability. Is my grid reliable to give me access to affordable and accessible energy? That's what they are asking for, but looking at the physical conditions of it. But when you look at the communities, they are thinking about the same things. Do I have affordable and accessible energy? Forget about the grid. I'm just saying, can I have power in my house? Can I afford to pay for that power? And that's where the discussion with the storage, the distributed energy resources, having battery storages, thermal storages is coming in to fill that gap. So each household has that. So we can either generate the energy through having solar panel. That's a good one example of it, but that's not the only example that can solve the problem. But also having the thermal storage as a bridging aspect of it. So I have consistent supply of energy. I don't know if we would get to the point where the 100% blackout would go away. I sincerely don't know, and I'm not going to stake my life on it. But at the same time, there has to be a preparation. So I'm thinking resilience in the emergency management world, there has to be some preparedness activities in place, some mitigation strategies. So the reliability is, if I go by the physical conditions, that is reliable. So I can design those according to that. Or the reliability is that I can reliably say, I'm going to have 100% energy even when there is an outage, because I have some alternate sources in the backyard. So that's the way my perception of a resilience is going, to bringing in reliability, redundancy into the picture. So that way, a resiliency means consistent, affordable supply of energy at any given time without having that outage hole in the middle, but at the household level.
But does that make for kind of trying to go after two different goals that may be competing? I mean, if we're trying to make the grid as reliable as possible so that there are no outages, and then we're also making investments for reliability or resilience in case it does go out, it seems like those two things can be in conflict to one another, right?
They can be, because the one side of the first part of your answer deals with the utilities, the second part deals with the households. But the second part, with having resiliency, addresses the question of energy burden and energy justice. If the utilities are going to spend money on making the grid resilient and reliability, does that mean my cost burden is going to go up? Which means some of the disadvantaged communities, they may not be able to afford that. So this discussion of having the reliability on the household side came into discussion, and especially the project we were doing in Puerto Rico for grid resilience, they wanted community solar. They wanted each community to have its own source, not just the utility holding it. So that's why this discussion is happening, that it may be conflicting, but at the same time, it is a necessity if we want to address the Justice 40 initiative requirements of energy burden and energy justice. However, I do agree with you that because utility is private, and the households are there has to be a policy discussion, because in California, there are behind the meter, the net meter reading is happening. They generate their energy. They give an option, if you have more energy generated at any given time, you can sell it back to the grid because there is a demand on the grid side. But how that cost aspect is supposed to be addressed is yet to be discussed, because I am in the same service area of the utility and I used 100% of what I generated, but I have extra 50% to sell to the grid. Does it mean my cost is going to go down for my 100%, or am I going to get some rebate back? So that discussion is happening a lot, especially in the energy economic space, because the net meter reading is a conversation that is becoming confusing. And that discussion is more confusing if you have multiple service areas overlapping. Like Duke Energy is a big one with a lot of distribution and transmission side, then that becomes much more confusing. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. And I think this pursues the discussion that's just been raised about resilience versus energy justice. Would you comment on the possible use of microgrids, especially microgrids in low-income areas that could, without having the individual homeowner own the battery storage or the solar panels or all that, have it community-owned, and then have that microgrid able to disconnect from the larger grid in the case of an emergency and continue to provide services to the community?
Yes, and that's the PR 100 was the project where that is what we were looking at. And at the island level, there is a need for that. They asked for it. They said, we would like a community-based microgrid and solar. So DOE there has been few projects funded to understand what that microgrid establishment is going to look like, because the microgrid means, is it supposed to be a microgrid just for my neighborhood or a bunch of neighborhoods, because it has to be paid for in some manner, and if it is within the service area. So establishing the microgrid is not the issue. That time, the energy burden issue and energy justice issue is taken care of, because the low-income communities have their microgrid, but the economics part, because we all are within the service area of the utility. How that should be addressed, that is something an energy economist will be able to answer, which I am not qualified to answer, but that discussion is happening. Because there is more and more discussion about islanding. Islanding is a concept that has been there, and it goes to the same approach of microgridding, having a set of houses, buildings that need to be provided for by that microgrid. So you are detached from the main grid under certain conditions, then you can have your energy supply all the time. But I think a major holdup in those contexts would be the economics and how the policy is going to be written out, because it is a private-public partnership that is going to play out.
Hey there, I've got a couple things. First, just an encouragement. I'm a modeler by training, and some pretty impressive modeling there. But now I lead TVA's R&D group, so advising people on how to make some hard decisions around these topics. One thing I find often in modeling is you can make a model that represents reality very well, but then how to make a decision from it is really the hard part. So I just encourage you to make sure that these models you can work backwards from the decision and get these things into decision makers' hands in a way they can actually use them. The other thing is a question. The grid that we had for a long time was developed without a lot of computer models and had some pretty good reliability. I wonder sometimes if we're a little overconfident in our modeling, in that there's always a drive to keep prices low for the consumer. So if you trust your model, you're going to do the minimum you can and still provide reliability, right? But if you're a little overconfident in your modeling, that can put you in a tough place. So is there a danger that sometimes over-trust in models puts us in a less resilient place?
Do you mean your TVA is overconfident in their models?
I think just in general, the practice of modeling can lead you to that.
Yeah.
And we obviously had some issues over Christmas, everybody understands. And there's a part of that we're looking into.
Yeah, I agree. I do modeling because I want to get an understanding of what the problem is going on. And often I find some of the areas where I become cynical or cautious, especially with the AI side of the discussion. we need to understand the processes. The models are as good as they are if not only representing the reality, but the changing processes and system interactions. If I can't capture them in my model, then the model output is going to be flawed at that point in time. So in what I showed in the project, we were trying to get there to understand the processes. So we did connect with the utility companies to ask them for the restoration modeling, saying, hey, what are the steps and what are the processes you have in place so that we can mimic it, so that we are not stepping on your toes but mimicking it, and we can generate the outputs, and working with them to get the data to validate what we are getting. Are they getting the same thing, and using historical events. But I do agree, models are not the panacea to the problem, but rather they are a way for understanding the different players and the different parameters, how they change over time. And that's what we were trying to get at. Because DOE only asked for these models and the outcomes for decision-making purpose, so they are prepared. Because they are not going to do anything on the ground, but they need to be prepared and save their back if needed, have the resources in place. So, but I do agree, models, no. I don't know, maybe AI and robots will be able to do that. Currently, I'm not.
They had an interview on NPR yesterday where they had an AI expert talking about how great it was and everything it did. And then they said, would you use it to guide space flight? And they were like, oh, God, no. No, I would never do that, right?
I hope not.
So I'm just wondering how much we know about the degree to which the impacts of lack of reliability in the system or damage to the system, energy system, can be mitigated by improving the response and recovery processes in a cost-effective way.
Yeah, I'm going to say I'm ignorant on that one. I'm not going to deny that. There was a project that was funded by DOE, the North American Energy Resilience Model, and that's what they were trying to get at, is basically using different kind of extreme events to assess the resilience of the current energy infrastructure and what actions to be taken. So it is an ongoing project, but I don't think we know that. And the reason I would say the way my thought process is working from a cost-benefit analysis in order to ensure it is how reliable is dependent on the baseline, what I'm using for climatic conditions. When the climatic conditions are such and extreme events are becoming very unpredictable, so whatever the outcome I come out with, saying, hey, my reliability is A in certain areas depending upon how old the infrastructure is, and my resource requirements would make sure I am there, will keep changing. And that's where I think the models have to be adaptable to those changing conditions to generate those outputs frequently until such time we don't need it. But I don't think we are there yet. Because of those unpredictability aspect of it. I was actually attending a workshop yesterday that was through National Academy of Sciences about digital twins, how digital twins could be used to address the questions. And one of the things I asked the panel is saying, how reliable the digital twin outputs are when I don't know the processes. If I don't know the processes, so how am I going to answer the uncertainties, the question you're asking? So digital twin is a good way of representing, but I think unless we know how the extreme event predictability will change, we probably would have a problem with that. The second part that I think would be an issue is with the supply chain side of it. We are still dependent on many things that would rely on other parts of the world to address generating new technologies. So if they are experiencing similar impacts, how that would play out for generating new technologies and addressing the reliability of some of those structures. So I sincerely don't know the answer, but I think we are not there yet to say cost benefit wise we can get there in 2 years or 5 years. But the NARM project was focused on assessing that aspect of the entire energy infrastructure for North America.
So basically my question is, how do you balance trying to increase our energy resilience while still trying to shift away from the use of fossil fuels, especially while a lot of these technologies are still being developed. They're still relatively new. You know, if you compare it to coal, we've been using coal to fuel our energy for a really long time now. And some of these sources like solar panels, nuclear power to an extent, like hydroelectric power, all that kind of stuff is still kind of being developed. And, you know, in its nature, the newer something is, the more likely it is that it's going to be less reliable, just because it's like you were saying with the solar panels, we don't necessarily have the people, like the manpower right now to be able to maintain all of that. We don't have the amount of people that we need to be able to install these solar panels and everything. So how do you kind of balance that line to where, you don't get to a point where your technology ends up becoming outdated in 10 years, 15 years?
That's a good question. And some of my collaborators who are in the National Energy Technology Laboratory, they deal with the coal and natural gas side of the discussion. But, okay, I would ask a reverse question on this one, because how do we balance with the new technologies? Yes, we are not there yet. The technologies are still being developed to make them much more efficient, especially with solar panels and whatnot, and the small modular reactors and hydro plants, smaller hydro plants. But at the same time, we need to be prepared that we know coal and natural gas is not an infinite source. So that pushes forward for the technologies to enhance in a way that we are not saying we are going to give up coal and natural gas tomorrow morning, but rather having a path forward for these newer technologies when they are going to deplete to zero. They are going to go there at some point in time. It may not be tomorrow morning, not next year, but at some point down the road. So when we do the energy resilience analysis, we take into account, that's why the project I showed about the oil and natural gas was, we are not there yet. The oil and natural gas are still being used for evacuation purposes. We don't have every vehicle that is an EV. So when we do the analysis, we do using the current conditions, but also bringing in the futuristic scenarios. If I have a grid in the middle, that is a microgrid, or it is any other renewable source or a distributed energy resource into the mix of my restoration, how much of my requirement can be shifted to this rather than coal and natural gas. So it is basically building a scenario to understand what that shifting is going to look like in terms of restoration or resilience activities. It is not saying let's wipe out the plate and do nothing, but build on scenarios so that we can get there. And that does require time, and it also requires making the case for everybody why there is a need to shift. It's not just, yeah, we hate everything. That's not the case. We are going to run out of them at some point in time. That's reality.
I'm wondering what the role of responsible energy use is in this forward plan. I say this, I'm asking a little bit personally because I'm the unfortunate victim of a neighbor who refuses to maintain an HVAC system that runs 20 hours a day when no one's home. I know it's a waste. I know it's a burden. I know it's not functioning properly. Unfortunately, the local municipality has removed themselves from the equation as far as insisting accountability, even though there is some ordinance that directs that. But in conversations I've had in the area, people are also, well, I keep my house at 60 in the summer because I can, or I keep it 80 in the winter because I can. Where is that? What's that fine line between having the right to use energy and having the right to be having the responsibility of using it cautiously, especially when the peak rates and all the other infrastructure, so many people are reliant on that. And I think that's the policy, I think where that comes in, it's only as good as how people follow it or how it's implemented. And to what degree are these people really impacting the residential use?
I don't know how to answer that question. However, one thing I realize is that the question you are asking comes down to understanding by everybody, because someone who is saying I can maintain this temperature within my house probably is perfectly fine paying the price for it. They have affordability. I think the question becomes problematic for those who can't afford. And often the stakeholder engagement, when we talk about energy justice and energy burden discussions, that's when the stakeholder participation is required. And more projects are looking into it. It's not about coming up with these technologies. It's not about grid is going to be reliable and utility is going to take part. And that's why in my diagram of the network, the stakeholders need to come to the table to discuss what the real issues are. Yes, the cost might be higher for one person who can pay lower for the other person, but at some point, everybody is impacted equally. And it is, again, if utilities say we are going to have a peak rate of X, if you are consuming more than Y kilowatt hours, then that time it would be felt by that person who can afford to pay $300 versus $500. So there is a lot more in the energy justice space. I hope your speaker on energy justice can go into that discussion. And the energy justice discussion more and more looks into the economic aspect of it. And it's not just resilience of the grid or the customer, it's the economic resilience of those communities. Can they afford to do it? And making them understand the byplay of some of these requirements. It's not just a personal choice, but it may have an impact on the grid in the long run. So unless they see it, they are not going to do it.
Do you think that's going to have to happen in the household, in that decision ultimately, or are cities, municipalities going to have to start implementing something, or
I hope it would be cities and municipalities do it, but the moment the dollar figure discussion happens, it impacts everybody from top to bottom. It's not only the one household, but everybody within the city. And if we go the route of having microgrids and community solars, probably that's the one place where more and more people would be more cautious about how they consume energy rather than just taking it for granted. And I think currently that's the case. At least coming from India, I have experienced rolling blackouts. But in the US, that is not a case, which means it is taken for granted. I remember talking to one individual and we were talking about some energy and he said, "What's the problem? You just switch on and switch off." I was like, oh my goodness, you just didn't tell me that. But often that vision is, I'll just switch on, there would be light, I switch off, there is no light. That's how it works. It's not. And I think that little bit of awareness is needed and more discussion is happening in that space. But it's not going to happen soon enough. And to be honest, the energy justice and burden discussion happened just a couple of years ago, although that problem has been there for a long time until the Justice 40 initiative. So it's going to get there, but it will take a little bit of time. And utilities have to play a bigger role along with the communities because they both have to be partners.
So there's several questions online. I haven't forgot about the online folks. And a lot of them touched on things we've already talked about. But one theme that comes out of the questions online is that we are moving to a world where there are going to be more people producing electricity than there has historically. And so as we have more of these people that are producing electricity, we need to focus less on thinking about net zero homes and have positive homes, right? It's not just that they're net zero, but they're somehow doing more than what they had done in the past. There's also a discussion in here about how does the ownership or the business model around the grid itself influence that transition, right? So if for the simple analogy as an economist, right, we currently have sort of a regulated monopoly in a lot of these cases, and we're now going to have a deregulated market that's not that deregulation won't be managed at all, right? It'll just depend on who's adopting what and which technologies people choose to adopt, and so it'll be a very unorderly decentralization as it currently goes. But is there a different way of thinking about the business model for the utility itself that's doing the generation transmission currently that would facilitate that transition that you're talking about?
Yes, that's why the net metering discussion of California was the example, because that's one place where this discussion has already started. Households producing their energy are not just consuming, so they are producers of energy as well as consumers of energy. Utility inherently is a producer, they are not consuming. So that discussion is happening to come up with a business model that ensures the partnership is profitable on both sides, but we are not there yet. And I think there would be some regulation has to be in place, because otherwise, if everybody is producing and consuming, then we may end up in the wild, wild west with everybody doing whatever. Doesn't matter, and utilities are going to be mad. So I don't think that's going to happen. But the economic discussions are revolving around in that aspect of decentralized production of energy as well as consumption of it at the household level beyond the utility. So there is a multi-scalar relationship that is being brought into the conversation. I don't know where it is. I'll find out. But she's an energy economist, therefore she may be able to look into it. But just kidding. But look up the net metering situation in California. This discussion is happening a lot more especially with the recent events and more discussion about producing, having solar panels or having storages and having generators in the backyard. This discussion is happening more and more. So I don't know where we are going to go, but we are not there yet to have a business model that we all are happy with.
Give me some insights on the political environment around this issue right now. You're spending more time in DC. Who's involved? Are you getting sort of bipartisan support for these questions? Are they interested in different things? I can imagine some people are very interested in the justice issues. Other people are interested in the reliability issues. Give us a little bit of an insight about where we're at on the political spectrum for this.
I'll be very cautious what I say.
Be very cautious. Yes, be very cautious.
No, to be honest, the reliability, resilience, and justice issue seems to be resonating across the board. So not just in DOE space, other institutes are talking about equity, justice, those things. Not just because energy is one place where we need to address it, but when we think about exposure to environmental conditions, air quality, your next speaker would talk about. So this discussion of justice and burden is happening across the board. So it is not just specific to one sector of the federal agency or one program. At the same time, the utilities are also there because they are realizing some of the issues that are happening, but utilities still have the hold because they are responsible for producing the energy at this point. They are on board, but they are not on board 100% to address this issue of equity and justice. That's where I find, that's what I am seeing, because I don't think it is just because of the administration. I think everybody realized the issue of energy justice and burden. It is touching everybody else. So that's my take on it. Politically, where we will go, I feel like whoever comes as the new congressperson probably would be the deciding factor. But I feel like this topic would stay in the sense we have to be resilient. We have seen extreme events. So more and more, like California's situation is a good example of it. They have wildfires, they have floods, they run out of hydropower, so it is happening, which means this is happening in a broader spectrum beyond the politics. And so therefore my take is it is going to be a topic of conversation until come up with a solution that addresses the need as well as towards decarbonization.
Great. So obviously, there's a lot of interest in this topic today, given how many people were here, another 150 people or so online listening. Excitement, not only because of recent events across the country, but also because there's a lot of people doing work in this space on the UT campus right now, all the way from thinking about the justice issues. Chin-Fei's in the room here thinking about these things, and we've got it all the way over to the more technical aspects too. So I'd like to think this is a place where we can make some progress on these questions, working with Oak Ridge, working with folks like yourself who are working in DC to try to get across that science. But thank you for being here today. Join me one more time in thanking our speaker.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And I live in this space, so I think some changes are needed. We just have to get there, slowly inching like a snail.